first, a kind of a word of context is that the pilot hasn't finished yet. So these aren't the kind of the final definitive insights from the pilot, but we have been working very closely. We've had ongoing sessions. So we've had fortnightly sessions throughout this academic year, plus insights that have been gained from individual institutions, and the first wave of summative evaluations. So while not definitive, they are still fairly robust insights from the pilot. So I'll talk a little bit about the project and the idea behind it. So we are very aware that one of the kind of the big promises of AI, not just in education, but generally, is that it can help to increase productivity, it can make things more efficient, and it can save people time. And our thinking was to apply that reasoning to education and think about some of the kind of the major pain points. One that came up time and time again was around assessment and within that marking and feedback. So we really wanted to answer the question, can AI have a meaningful impact in reducing the workload around marking and feedback? But we were also very clear right from the beginning that it wasn't just about a kind of a mechanical question of its efficacy in reducing workload. This is a very important part of the educational process. It's a key area in which staff demonstrate their expertise and their judgment. It's a key part of conferring marking work and conferring qualifications. It's a key part of a key way in which organisations define themselves, and it's important for students that there is that element of validation, that someone knowing an expert is engaging in their work. So we really wanted to understand as well the attitudes to this and the perceptions, and learning from that if we could find some important insights into where AI might be best placed to support the marking and feedback process. So yeah, does it save time? If so, how much? Under what conditions? And what are student and staff perceptions? How do they change? How do different approaches impact these perceptions? So the guiding question there was can it reduce workload, and can it do so in an acceptable way? And we've come up with a number of sort of key insights that I want to talk through based on this, and then I'll kind of round them up in terms of what the kind of tentative answer to that question is. So one of the insights is that formative first, formative assessments were very much the kind of the context that lent itself most to having AI involved. And this is partly about the fact that it is inherently lower stakes. It's not no stakes by any means. It's still really important to give good quality, valid, accurate feedback. But there's one of the other things that emerged as to why formative lent itself much more than summative assessment in the initial stages of implementation was that formative assessment is very much seen as part of the learning journey. It's not just the end point of the learning journey. It's a means of supporting and driving learning through good quality feedback. And one of the things that AI is very good at is enabling larger volumes, potentially richer levels of feedback to be given to students. We found it being very good in some cases to reduce the turnaround time, so that feedback, rather than taking a number of weeks, could take a much less time. And there's also been in some cases opportunities for AI for more feedback opportunities that wouldn't necessarily have been there because they are lighter touch and more manageable. So that was it was a key area. People were very keen on that sort of that low risk, high value use cases as part of a use as part of a pilot, and formative did deliver in that respect. Um, One of the key things that we found out is that, as we expected, there are some very real anxieties amongst staff and students. And it was important to think about, well, how do you work with those and how do you help address those? And to what extent is it appropriate to do so? Um, so some of the kind of the issues that we heard people talking about were um, didn't like AI more generally, and or at least were cautious about AI's use more generally. From a student perspective, this often came from issues around sustainability and the environment, concerns about their future prospects based on potential for job market contractions in the industries that they wanted to work in. Um, but we also found that that people can be more reassured, and people were more positive about it when they understood what the kind of the rationale was for this particular use case, how the kind of the purpose and the framing of an application of AI was limited. So people understanding that there are safeguards in place. AI is not we're not aiming to creep towards automation of these processes. It's about using AI to add efficiencies. And one of the things that was a really practical lesson was that it was often very useful to just have direct communication from the staff who were involved in the pilot. If a staff member had kind of thought about the pilot, thought about the benefits, knew what they wanted to get out of it, knew what was important to them in terms of risk management and mitigation, if they could convey that directly to their students, students tended to be much more on board with it than if it was a kind of a sort of a generic institutional um, circular communication. One of the things that we did as part of the pilot was bring participants together and held a number of workshops looking at what we meant by what ethics meant to individuals, and how could you both pin down the principles of ethics, but also translate those into practice. So the three big things that came up as the main principles that people saw as their priorities were respect for privacy and ownership, attention to the social environmental impacts, and commitment to fairness as well. We then did an exercise to kind of think about what are the effective ways of translating these principles and making sure that they emerge and um, are sort of deep-seated in practice. And interestingly, a lot of this revolved around not just the sort of technological due diligence side of things, and not just high level policy, but more about the kind of the individual capability amongst staff and amongst students. So human oversight and that ability to check, to verify, to validate AI outputs, while also having a clear role in steering those AI outputs in the first place by either how you're prompting or how you're configuring AI tools, was seen as a really important factor. Transparency, so making sure that you were clear in how AI was used, but also in terms of how AI and humans were working together. So the kind of the wider systems in which AI was embedded was seen as a really positive thing. Training the staff, so making sure that there was that kind of individual capability. And a useful an idea that came out of these was having a rationale document for each kind of key use case of AI. So this would involve and explaining to people why you chose an AI to support, whether that be, in this case, would be marking and feedback, but it could be for other use cases such as resource generation. Um, what were the intended benefits? Why AI was a suitable candidate for achieving those benefits? What the risks were? How those could be mitigated? Were the kind of the key things people would want to see there. One of the pieces of one of the really interesting set of insights that's come from this pilot is this issue of the human in the loop, and I think it's a very it's a phrase that people will hear quite a lot when referring to AI, both in education and in other sectors in which AI is used. But I think one of the things that has become clear through the pilot is that often needs a bit of firming up in terms of what we mean by human in the loop. Is it sufficient to say, well, a human has glanced at the AI output, has sort of clicked, yes, that's fine, and that suffices in perhaps the same way that people might do with if they're sort of accept here when they're signing up to a new thing or a new platform or something. Um, we clearly that's not what we have in mind when we think about human in the loop. We want that sense that people can still take ownership of the outputs that they've developed collaboratively with AI. Um, So some of the things we wanted to avoid there in specifically in the context of marking and feedback was the human being steered by the AI. So even if a human is with all the best of intentions really engaging with this is a the piece of feedback that the AI is given, a human might be reading it thoroughly rather than just skimming it. But there's still the risk there of that kind of cognitive pegging of them thinking, yes, I will agree with this. This has kind of been worded sensibly. That sort of starts to frame and flavor the staff perception rather than it being purely their judgment. So that's one. I mentioned that kind of take a quick glance. But the other thing we also want to avoid is humans completely duplicating the work of AI, because then that would negate the point of having the AI there in the first place. Of course, if you need to do the same work twice to be sure, then the reality is then AI probably isn't the right solution to use. But at the same time, if we can find ways that where you don't have to duplicate the work, but can have some of the added efficiencies, that's obviously the kind of a goal, would be a win-win situation. So some interesting use cases occurred and arise that people talked about as part of the pilot in terms of how they were meaningfully keeping the human in the loop. And one was to have AI focus on the sort of the more mechanical and lower level aspects of a task. So the quality of written communication, spelling, grammar, um, how it was structured into paragraphs, some of the kind of the phrasing as well, so that the educator could focus their attention on their domain knowledge, their critical thinking, that kind of deeper level of understanding exhibited through the work. Um, Another one of the use cases that kind of thinks about AI and humans and apportions the task was to have AI doing an analysis against a rubric. And this works when you've got a very clear rubric and you're not kind of leaving things up to sort of tacit knowledge. AI can kind of say, right, you've met this here and you've met this to this extent. And it can be very effective at that, but it might often miss that kind of the overall effectiveness of a piece. And it might, not be able to pick out these sort of standout examples. And so actually splitting things up and saying, right, AI is doing that quite mechanical job of checking something against the rubric. The expert is viewing the student's work based on their own expertise and is giving that kind of overall judgment that's much harder to kind of to pin down and to put into a spreadsheet. One of the interesting ideas, we didn't see people do this as part of this pilot, but we have seen other examples of this, is that the idea that actually splitting it into two stages. There is work marked by AI, which is the very early stage drafts of a piece of work, and there's work marked by humans. And the idea there is that AI isn't reducing the workload for that final submission at all, but it is allowing for additional feedback to students throughout that journey by providing an initial point there. There's some things to note about that is that people were sometimes a bit cautious about that because it could steer students in the wrong direction. It could give them false hope or it could demotivate them. So that wasn't something that was seen as a universal, but there were people who were kind of keen on that idea because it can support human agency um, and yeah, and can just help the students to improve in an iterative way. And another example was, and this was the idea that the AI isn't the marker at all. The AI is there to write up feedback that a human has already given. And so that would involve the human does the writing. They start with a kind of a set of notes, their key judgments, and the AI can write that up into something that is an educator absolutely could do and probably could do better, but it just frees up an extra 10 minutes per script to turn that kind of note-based feedback into something that students can digest and go away and use as part of that feed forward as well. So pulling that together, then the kind of the key insights there were to start formative. I'm afraid I may have missed the second point there, which is reframing the benefit. I'll talk to that just slightly. And the point there was that one of the things that we found during the pilot was that we were not fixated, but our focus was on workload and reducing workload. But we quickly found that people sort of pushed back, both staff and students, that this isn't just about reducing workload. It's about the quality of marking. It's about supporting the amount of marking that an institution can give through. So thinking back to this slide, for instance, here in terms of those kind of use cases of AI, we're talking about kind of extra kind of insight. So giving more learning opportunities, more in-depth feedback. Those are the things that really started to attract people in a lot of cases. So we did reframe it slightly. And the other thing to note is that students, while saying to staff reducing workload, it may be a big win for them, it's something that students are much less interested in. And obviously there have to be other benefits to sell to students to kind of develop that kind of sense of mutual benefit and trust from a project like this. So key insights there: start formative, reframing the benefits, not just about workload. Quality is also really important, and consistency and the timeliness of feedback. Lead with have the human in the loop, make ethics practical, and have that kind of that transparency and openness as well. What are key aspects of that? Fantastic. So that's all from sides.